Dear all, welcome to this webinar here at RUSI. My name is Carlos Solar. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Latin American Security at the International Security Team at RUSI. And I have the pleasure to have with me three renowned experts on Colombia. For today, we'll be speaking on and evaluating, hopefully evaluating this paz total in Spanish, the total peace policy that it's been implemented in Colombia after many years of security struggle, reforms, governance at the security sector, and politics and international relations. I have the pleasure to be with three experts in Colombia. I would like to introduce first to Dr. Renata Segura, who is the Deputy Director for Latin America at the International Crisis Group. I really invite you to look for Renata's profile and to look some of her team's latest research on Colombia. As you know, the Crisis Group does not only look at Colombia, but it does look at the region more widely. There is very interesting research from the Crisis Group, and I welcome Renata, and I look forward to having a conversation with her. Next, we travel to Colombia. Renata sits currently in New York, and then we travel to Bogota, where Associate Professor of Oscar Palma from Universidad del Rosario is, I have the pleasure of knowing him from a few years now. He's a good friend of RUSI. His research is on international security, on civil-military relations, and of course, more drug trafficking related security problems within Colombia, who are so pervasive to the fields of international relations and political science. And then last but not least, we have Mr. Juan Pablo Toro, who is the Executive Director of Athena Lab. Athena Lab is a prime, an upcoming think tank in Santiago de Chile, but Juan Pablo lived for long in Colombia, while he wore another hat, that of a journalist, where he was the correspondent for Associated Press for 5 years, correct me if I'm wrong, Juan Pablo, and then he moved to Mexico to continue reporting and having an in situ perspective of these two countries. So the way the webinar will run is that I'll share a conversation with these three experts. I really invite the people in the audience to type down their questions. I think we're going to have a flexible and honest conversation about what paz total really means, how we got there, and the many smaller ideas within the grandiose of thinking that total peace can be achieved by Gustavo Petro's government, and why not be critical, but of course encouraging to new ideas of what has happened before and what's the future for Colombia. So I think I'll go straight to the questions, and let me ask Renata probably the most basic question that we all ask ourselves whenever it is that we're following on Colombia is what it is paz total, right? So what is this idea of it's a great marketing idea for political reasons. Paz total, I mean, it's encompassive, it's not military, it's human, it's civilian oriented, and so on. So Renata, can we talk about these two concepts quite briefly to introduce them, paz and then total, right? Total and peace.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos, for having us today here. I mean, the question of what paz total is, I think, has taken a lot of the time of those of us who follow Colombian politics in detail, and part of the issue is that the government has not produced a document that really explains what paz total means. So we have all sort of come up with our own conclusions based, I mean, in great part, obviously, to the law of paz total that Congress passed last December, but also the multiple interventions that both Petro, but also Danilo Rueda, High Commissioner for Peace, Iván Cepeda, and those people close to him who are working on the implementation of this agreement. So as you say, paz total is the idea to, let's say, build on the progress that Colombia did with the 2016 peace agreement with the FARC, but actually expanded to all of the armed actors. And it's based on a very realistic premise. It sort of understands that after the FARC retrieved from the territories that they controlled and demobilized, other armed actors came and took over those spaces, and that the state wasn't able to enter as fast as we would have hoped. And so that the violence remains, maybe not at the levels that we had prior to the demobilization of the FARC, but in certain areas of the country, clearly very, very high. And sort of the very core idea is that if we don't, and I mean Colombia, negotiate with every single, I should not say the word negotiate, have dialogues or establish processes of conversations with every armed actor that is currently operating in the country, there is never going to be a total peace. Because if you demobilize the ELN or just tackle one particular criminal group and continue with the security strategy that we've had so far, which is of targeting heads of criminal groups, then there will always be one other group that enters those spaces and continues to reproduce violence. So the idea has been for the government to establish conversations with both the guerrilla groups that have some political standing, but also with criminal groups that don't have a political agenda necessarily, although we can have a conversation about how some of those groups, like the Gaitanistas, have been trying to present themselves as a political actor because of legislation that actually restrains the amount of conversations that the state can have with criminal actors. And the idea is to establish at least at the beginning ceasefires. And in the hopes that even if we do not get to the demobilization of all those criminal actors, at least the levels of violence that they are exerting against the communities will go down. And this sort of negotiation conversation strategy goes simultaneously with a transformation in the security strategy, in which the army then switches these modus operandi of really targeting the criminal groups and starts defending civilians as the core mission, particularly in the rural areas. That doesn't mean, obviously, that there's not going to continue to be targeting of those criminal groups that are not engaged in the conversations, but at least the main sort of focus of the security is to prevent attacks and assassinations against the rural communities. I would say that those are sort of the two core bases in which Paz Total is based.
Thank you, Renata. Jumping to Oscar, let me pick on your associate professor brain. Renata touched a point that is core here, and that's about state capability, right? So is the state capable, is the Colombian state at 2023 capable of delivering, at least in the 2 or 3 pillars that Renata was able to identify, which are already quite hugely problematic, I'll say?
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and RUSI as well, as you mentioned. I have a deep appreciation of RUSI, so it's always a pleasure to participate in your events and webinars and all this invitations. So thank you very much. Just to complement Renata on something, I agree with the vision and the definition of what total peace actually is. We don't have a document or strategy telling us what peace total is supposed to be. So that has led into just the discussion and the everyone just saying total peace is this, total peace is that. There is a law, as Renata also mentioned, that is supposed to define total paz total. It does not define the concept itself of paz total. It just mentioned it's a policy, and it's a policy that is supposed to be a state policy, not a government policy. And then it describes what it wants to do, which is exactly what Renata actually mentioned. But we do not have a definition itself of the concept of paz total. What is total peace then? Well, it's up to interpretation. There's no specific program, there's no strategy, there's not a specific document telling us from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 how it's supposed to be done. So that's what generates a lot of confusion, and the evaluation itself becomes difficult. On your question on the capabilities, well, the state has proved, the military forces have proved to have some capacity to fight insurgents and criminal groups in many of Colombia's regions. So it depends on what specifically are we analyzing in terms of the capacity. Through the years, the military forces have been successful in fighting many rebel groups. The case of FARC, the case of ELN in the past as well. The problem is the way we're conceiving peace, this total peace and security and human security, it requires much more than just a strong military force, a strong police force. It requires a strong state. And when I say state, I mean all of the institutions of the state, you know, the ministers, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Economics, how we can achieve development in many of the rural areas that have seen conflict for ages. That requires an integral action of the state, not just the security apparatus, but, you know, bringing real economic conditions that may allow people to create their own economic circumstances away from the drug economy. And that's where the doubt is. Do we have the capacity to do that? And do we actually have the possibility to have different sectors coordinating between them? That coordination capacity is also in doubt, and it has been in doubt for decades, not only today, but for history. Do institutions understand? For example, does the Minister of Agriculture understand its role in security of a country? And that's where I believe that we are not really having or building these capacities. So yes, in some aspects, Carlos, so security-wise, military-wise, we might have some capacities, but thinking about a comprehensive action of the state, which is coordinated with a program and getting into every region that needs to be addressed, I have serious doubts about that.
Well, I think that's a point that we can always compare to other countries that are going through security problems, right? So even the most advanced industrialized democracy, if we want to call them, have struggled with all the conflicts in terms of combining, networking, aligning departments, agencies, and so on. I mean, the larger the state, the more difficult it is to put together all these silos, especially when you've had a conflict that has been driven by military operations and military plans for so long. I guess that now I want to travel back in time a little bit to Juan Pablo and really pick on his experience in the early 2000s in Colombia. I mean, I'm a good friend of Juan Pablo, so I've seen his pictures on helicopters, on boats, and so on. So Juan Pablo, can you tell us a little bit how it was Colombia back in the 2000s, just with the exercise of them jumping again back to 2023 and see if actually there is a disruption with Paz Total and probably Colombia has entered a new stage compared to the early 2000s? Or do you see that there is more of a continuity in terms of where Colombia has ended over the last 2 decades or so?
Well, first of all, thanks, Carlos and RUSI, for inviting me to this interesting conversation. As you mentioned, I lived in Colombia, and I feel it's my second home in the world. I've been traveling to Colombia many times after leader. Let me say, well, there's a sub-specialty in social science in Colombia called violentology. What this means? This means that a lot of professionals that study violence across the decades. In the 60s, 3 famous sociologists from that time, Umaña, Falsborda, and Guzman, they wrote a book called La Violencia. And at that time, they identified the main causes of the violence in Colombia after the period called La Violencia, a civil war between conservatives and liberals. And they identified 2 causes. One is exclusive democracy. Now the democracy in Colombia is very inclusive. Even a former guerrilla can become a president. And the other cause is the lack of presence of the state across the territory. The state in a world sense. I mean, that was Oscar explained very well. And this is still not solved. The terrain in Colombia is huge and it's very complex. Colombia is caused by 3 mountain ridges. The Andes mountains split in 3 mountain ridges. There are big extensions of jungles. So it's very difficult for the state of Colombia to reach every space and occupy every space. So there are constants that I can identify from that time and this time. Well, the lack of the presence of the state, of course, but basically the conflict in that time and this time is financed by illegal economies. Drug trafficking, obviously. Now it surprised me, but Colombia is in a record high of production of cocaine, 1,200 tons of cocaine, more than the time that I lived when the Americans and the Colombians launched the Plan Colombia and reduced the production of cocaine in a very severe way. So also now you got illegal mining. It's very important in terms of gold mining. And this, I think the conflict right now is more complex than it used to be. There are many actors. You know, basically, well, the great part of FARC demobilized in 2016, but now there are some guerrillas that come from the FARC. The Estado Mayor Central is one, and the total peace is failing in order to produce these ceasefires. Recently, the Estado Mayor Central was responsible for killing 3 boys, indigenous boys, 4 boys, indigenous boys, that deserted from that guerrilla. So the ceasefire with the Estado Mayor Central was suspended by Petro's government. Also, the ELN suspended the ceasefire with the Petro's government, and also the Clan del Golfo, the narco paramilitary group in the north of Colombia. So total peace is failing. I don't see any strategy, but I think more actors and more dedicated to illegal economies and more kind of illegal economies, and in some time, in some way, I think that the fact that the ELN is a binational guerrilla with presence in Colombia and also in Venezuela add more complexity to this problem that used to be. And my time you basically you got 3 main groups: the ELN, the FARC, and the AUC, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the paramilitary guys. So you can talk with 3 different leaderships, but now there's more complex. There's a kind of atomization of groups. I think total peace is more an aspiration and a very complex one than a strategy itself. Thanks.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Renata, going back to you, I think you mentioned something that's quite relevant, and you mentioned that there's no definition by law, of course, complemented by what Oscar mentioned as well. But if you look at definitions of current vices along the region, there aren't that many differentiations. So there isn't that much of a definition of what organized crime is, and so on. So sometimes legislators, lawyers, politicians, decision makers at the very top level decide to go for open and flexible terms in which they can later review and actually play their hand on whatever it is. I mean, if you create something that's too strict from the start, probably you're gonna find yourself with little room to move or to react to whatever happens at the moment. So first question to you, Renata, is: do you think this was purposefully a concept which wasn't led by that much of a legal definition of a policy background and so on, or do you think this is just a failure of politicians being able to draw a roadmap for Colombia?
I mean, that's a good question. It requires a little bit of speculation, obviously. I'm not inside Petro's brain, so it's hard to know. My guess is that it's both. You know, as you probably know, Colombia is a super legalistic country, and there is anybody that you have a conversation will just start like barraging you with names of decrees that at some point or other have marked who we can have conversations with and who we can't. And in that sense, even though the definitions about what constitutes an illegal armed, a politically inclined armed group vis-a-vis just a criminal group are blurry, there are certain legal parameters that have been in place in Colombia for a very long time. I mean, understanding that most of our guerrilla groups who had a political agenda and had political status and were seen as valid interlocutors by the state, most of them have engaged in illicit economies, be it drug trafficking, illegal mining, etc. There's still a differentiation between those that do have a political agenda or have pretend to have a political agenda that gives them the status of insurgencies, and those who are just there to become rich. Now, that is sort of the question of what's happening right now, right? We have the ELN, which because of its historical trajectories, we can say it remains a political group. We have the EMC, el Estado Mayor Conjunto, which is the FARC dissidents, which is a little bit of a complicated status because they had the opportunity to go through a peace agreement and they chose not to. Plus, we have those that were part of the agreement themselves, but then decided to withdraw because they were not pleased with the way in which it was being implemented. And then you have people like El Plan del Golfo and also all of the rural criminal groups, urban criminal groups, which are smaller, but that have also been engaged in conversations with the administration. So to really pretend that the government comes out with like some kind of definition of where each of these groups stands, it's probably unrealistic because also of the way in which some of this group operates. For example, the ELN, they're fairly decentralized. It's not that there is a mandate from above saying we're going to engage in drug trafficking or not, even though the people that are currently in Havana negotiating might be rejecting the idea that they get involved in illicit economies. In reality, it happens on the ground with some fronts more than with others. So it seems to me that it might have been just a product of disorganization, but it's not a terrible thing that we don't have these very rigid structures, because the reality is the conflict is not very rigid and it fluctuates and it changes throughout time. And this is something that is going to have to work for 4 years. Now, the question to me, more than legal, although in Colombia it always goes back to legal, it's really political. It's I think the country, precisely because of the experience with the FARC peace process, is now sort of very open to the idea of having a negotiation with the ELN, even perhaps with the EMC and other dissidences with the FARC. But I think the question remains of how much Colombians, and by Colombians I mean the political actors that are going to have to sign the laws into being if we get there, but also just the general opinion, public opinion. How do people feel about engaging in negotiations with criminal groups that have done really, really awful things and that do not have any kind of political agenda? And not only the question in my mind is not only like, is this something that the public is going to accept, but also, what does the government have that will bring to the table these people? Because you know that the ELN, that you know that the ex-FARC, you know that these people have political ambitions. So they might be willing to demobilize in exchange for seats in Congress, for like spaces of regional power, some meaningful participation politically. Is that what the Gulf Clan wants? That's never been their aspirations and their ambitions. I mean, now some of these groups are actually framing themselves in that way, I think, to take advantage of these conversations and very much mindful of the legal limits that the government has in having conversations with these groups, which technically can only lead to surrendering, not to real negotiations in the sense that as we have with the guerrilla groups. But these are people that are making crazy amounts of money, with the illicit economies, that the government is not realistically going to be able to propose something to them that will give them equal amount of income, and that I don't see very clear what is it that the government can put in the table that will bring a group like that to say, okay, we're going to demobilize. So I think what we really are talking in practice is about peaceful coexistence with illicit economies. I think that is in reality as good as this is going to get. We might be able to demobilize some combos in Medellin, and the example of what's happening in Buenaventura has been very instructive. Buenaventura is a medium-sized town, maybe a small medium-sized town in the Pacific, where peace truces have been implemented with a lot of the criminal groups that work in that city. And we have seen very, very significant reductions of violence in the last few months in a place that was one of the core centers of violence in the country. Is that mean that the businesses behind that are being demobilized? No, it isn't, right? And so the question is, what are the kinds of pacts and concessions that Colombians are willing to give to these criminal groups if the reward, let's say, if the goal is to then minimize the levels of violence that we're seeing in certain regions? And I think that is the question that is occupying a lot of us, and certainly is going to occupy the government in the coming months if these conversations continue.
Thank you, Renata. Oscar, if you were to become a very close advisor to President Petro, if he was to call you tomorrow to the university and say, please come, because I listened to this webinar at RUSI yesterday, and I really need to put an evaluation plan of Paz Total. I know it's a hard question, but let's say there's the need to create a group to evaluate. What do you think will be areas, points, stages, anything that comes to mind in terms of evaluation, taking into consideration this conversation with Renata and Juan Pablo?
Great, Carlos. I don't think that's actually going to happen. But if that does happen at some point, I think it would be interesting to have a discussion. To begin with, I would like to, and going back to the concept of total peace, I think it's interesting. I think it would be more appropriate to see the concept as a political marketing slogan, as a political marketing motto, than a proper concept, than a strict concept, or than a policy itself. And I think it plays a lot on what happened years before with Juan Manuel Santos and the peace process and negotiations, because the narrative that we have in the government, the Colombian government then, was basically peace. We're going to achieve peace, and this is a peace process, and it's the end of conflict. And we started even talking about post-conflict, a post-conflict era, the end of conflict, the achievement of peace. But that didn't happen basically because we had more groups, more armed groups in the field, the ELN, other criminal groups as well. So peace didn't really happen. So what this government's after doing is going back to that and saying, now we're going to finish the job. So it was then peace. Now it's total peace. Now we're finally going to do it, bringing up all these groups that were there in discussions and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's why total peace is more a political slogan than a real concept or a legal even discussion about it. Coming back to your question, I believe that it would be relevant to really have a carefully detailed strategy of how this is all going to happen. And strategy means that we need to have a clear schedule of how everything is done and who are the actors involved in each of these conversations. And furthermore, what criteria, what parameters, what variables are going to be measured in each of the processes to be able to say, this is successful, this is good, this is bad. We don't have that. We don't have a general plan. We don't know what we're navigating. If you see negotiations with the ELN and then with the EMC, with the Estado Mayor Central, you would think this is just a big mess. The government says there's going to be a period of no military action against these groups, a ceasefire agreement, And then the ELN says, we haven't agreed on a ceasefire agreement. So the people are saying, what is there a ceasefire? Is there no ceasefire? And then President in his court, in his speech, says that he's not really sure that the ELN has the capacity to force all of its lower rank commanders and all of its war fronts to follow suit their orders. And the ELN comes back and says, what does that mean? Are you saying that we are not a unified single organization with command and control guaranteed? So it's just messages everywhere telling us, okay, we don't know where we are. It's quite messy around. So to begin with, we need to have a clear schedule, a clear strategy pointing, okay, number 1, number 2, number 3 with this group, and then with the other group, number 1, number 2, number 3. Now with the other group, then same thing, detailing which is the agenda, which are the actors, how are we going to evaluate this? And that is a lot, Carlos, that is a lot to do. President Santos did well in a single negotiation with one group, and the agenda was carefully designed, it was publicly known, and we knew how we could evaluate that negotiation. But current government wants to do that with all of the groups that are out there. So it's a lot to do. I remember that people were saying, we're using the reference of that movie that won the Oscar at Hollywood, which was Everything Everywhere All at Once. It's kind of the same strategy here, you know, like the government is trying to do everything everywhere all at once, but we don't know how. So if we want to evaluate, if we want to really clearly know what's going to happen, we first need to know, okay, what's the carefully tailored strategy with each of the groups, with all of the agents in a measurable way, which are the variables, which are the elements that we can evaluate the process with. So that would kind of be the way to reply. But once again, I don't think that's going to happen, Carlos.
Thank you, Oscar. It was just to play with you a little bit and get a good answer. Juan Pablo, do you remember this level of uncertainty when you were covering the country? You mentioned that Plan Colombia was just kicking, so at least that plan had some strategy thinking behind it. But again, do you remember this level of uncertainty among people that really follows the day-to-day of Colombia?
Yes, I mean, on that time, the peace process with the FARC fails in a very bad way. Also, America are launching the Plan Colombia. So I think the Colombians live through uncertainty. They know how to do it. No? But this is not the first initiative in terms of trying to negotiate with different armed groups. There's a long history of peace negotiations with failures, with a few success. So there's right now, as I told before, there's a very complex situation. 3 of the ceasefires basically fail with the EMC, with Clan del Golfo, and with the ELN, as Oscar mentioned. And I think Petro is in a very difficult moment in terms to prove what total peace means. And what it means when there's no possibility of dialogue with different groups. Because he's a former guerrilla, he knows a lot about insurgency, but now he should prove that he knows about counterinsurgency. And these groups understand the language of force. That's the reality, especially with the former FARC guys. They're very tough in that sense. But total peace, in some way, is what every government tries to do during the last 60 years with different means. Sometimes betting on force, sometimes betting on dialogue, sometimes in both, combining both in different levels. But now Petro, I think Petro he needs to prove that he can use the language of force to prove that these groups that the Colombian military are ready to fight. There's a very difficult situation inside the Colombian military right now. There are many officers, including generals and colonels, asking for early retirements. So you can understand how the military forces are reading the current situation. Maybe they are not sure about the willingness of the government to fight these groups in a very frontal way. So I think it's a very uncertain situation, but right now I think the Petro, he needs to move his pieces in this chessboard.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Renata, you have your hand up.
I'm going to come out and defend Petro, but I am going to defend Petro. Because I don't think this is what other governments have tried to do in the past. I really do not think that this is a continuation, even of what Santos, which has been by any means of the imagination, the most daring and sort of out there of the presidents in trying to do a peace agreement. I think Petro's coming from a completely different understanding of what the conflict is. He has a completely different understanding of what he envisions the long term of Colombia. But also very importantly, and I think this is perhaps at the center of the chaos of this whole situation, he knows he has very little time. He knows he's probably not going to be reelected and nobody from his movement will be reelected. And he knows he has incredibly powerful enemies, both in power and outside of power, that are going to try and sabotage this. And we've seen very, very outspoken criticisms, even from the people that you would consider more progressive and like willing to have conversations. So I think that this is by far the most risky and sort of ambitious proposal around peace that has been brought to the table in Colombia since the beginning of the war in the 60s. And unfortunately, it does not have the sort of planning and thought and infrastructure that it requires to be implemented successfully in the time that we have, which is very, very short at this point. It's just 3 years. I mean, as Oscar said, we don't know. It's difficult to do any monitoring and evaluation of a plan that we don't know what the parameters are. I mean, for all we know, there is a plan that they just have not shared with us, right? Like, I'm hoping that Danilo Rueda has a plan in his office in which he has like some steps and he knows what is coming and what is not coming. The fact is, for some whatever reason, they haven't shared it with the general community, and I don't fully blame them, because I think they are paranoid about the level of opposition that this is going to awaken. And I think they're rightfully paranoid about it, because there is a lot of vested interest in the country to have this not work among certain sectors. So, and then there's also very legitimate concerns like the ones that I was describing earlier about people feeling that this is all going to end up in a pax mafiosa that in the end is going to just strengthen the groups in the long term, and that what we're giving them is a 3-year period. I think Juan Pablo very, very accurately put his finger in one of the most complicated issues, which is the role that the army is going to have in this. I think there is a little bit of hysteria around the resignation of some of the heads. We are in a lot of contact. Crisis Group has been in incredible contact with the military for the last 2 years. We produced a very extensive 2 reports really on the security strategy and what that means for the military. I think the people who are in power in the military right now are on board with the strategy and they want to make it work. But there is also very clearly the need for the security strategy to be there to make these groups come to the table. the Canaan del Golfo is not going to come to the table out of the goodness of their heart. It's not that Geronimo is going to wake up tomorrow in Urabá and say, oh, you know what? Yes, let's demobilize. If these people are not against a corner, this is not going to happen. And unfortunately, the army is not being able to put that pressure right now. I think part of that is on the government and the lack of leadership, but I think there's also structural problems with the military that go beyond what the Petro administration can do. But I do think that we owe Petro the sort of recognition of the ambition and the sort of level of foresight of what this could mean if it was implemented well. Unfortunately, right now, if you told me like, where are you putting your money? It's like, I'm not putting my money on this succeeding, mostly because of what we've talked about today, right? Like, honestly, a lot, because Petro tweets way too much and says too many things like that are not being discussed with anybody. I feel bad for his team who's sitting in Havana trying to have a negotiation, and he's like essentially simultaneously sabotaging it, you know. I wish there was a bigger team in the High Commissioner's office that was able to do this. But look, they are surrounded. They have the support of the UN. They have the support of a lot of the international community. There are things that are out there that could allow this to happen. And I think until we don't see this fail, at least from Crisis Group, we're rooting for it to work, because we do think that if it did work, it would be a significant improvement in the condition of life of many, many, many Colombians that live in the countryside. And just a last word, because I don't want to be obnoxious and take all the time, but one of the issues that we have raised consistently throughout the recent months is that we do feel that the ceasefire is not sufficient, and that what we need to be talking about is a cessation of hostilities. Because even though the homicides are going down in many of the areas where the criminal groups are present, we're seeing other ways of implementing social control over these communities. So we're seeing high levels of children recruitment. We're seeing very, very high levels of sexual and gender-based violence. We're also looking at forced confinement and other mechanisms of control. So the fact that they're not killing people doesn't mean that people are being able to live free and save lives. And so that needs to be the honor, I think, where we put the focus in the coming months.
Thank you, Renata. I think I'm going to pick on one theme that it's on the chat, and I thank Rafael Mareto for his comments. To ask you, Oscar, in specific, I mean, Colombia has an international reputation, right? Especially its military. It recently joined NATO. The military has become a real player in terms of, you know, counterinsurgency. It's traveled the world with lessons learned and so on. It caught my attention yesterday when the UK foreign minister was leaving Colombia towards Chile, that the Colombian government, specifically the Ministry of Defense, signed an agreement with the Minister of Defense in Venezuela. So I think we can probably dedicate the last 15 minutes of this conversation a little bit to that piece of the puzzle, right? So it's neighbors to the north, and then we can chat a little bit more about international organizations and probably go as far down to where Juan Pablo sits at the moment in Santiago. But can you, Oscar, tell me a little bit about how this defense diplomacy of Colombia is being played within Paz Total? Is it really an angle that might be lucrative for government, or is it really something that's been downplayed because of the civil-military tension that might be at the moment?
Great. Yes, I think that, well, the military forces, because of the nature of our internal conflicts, have become quite knowable in how to fight an insurgency and how to fight organized crime in specific tasks like demining, for example, which is a tough task to do in Colombia, and the military forces have become really expert on that. Further at that, if you think about counterinsurgency in its purity, in the theory of counterinsurgency, you would have to see all these other missions that the military forces need to do when they're fighting insurgency that go beyond fighting, that go beyond just taking your weapons and fighting insurgents. You need to build bridges between the military forces and the communities. So you've got all of this aspect related to how to approach communities, what to do with the communities in order to achieve their development. And that brings us to all of what the Colombian military engineers have actually done for the development in Colombia. And it's quite a nice experience there as well. So the building of roads, the building of bridges, from health to education missions specifically, like the military forces have really built a wide range of services that are important in countries that are fighting insurgents and criminals. And they cooperate specifically with specific development tasks that you need to achieve in specific regions. This know-how has been shared with many countries, specifically in Latin America, especially in Latin America, that are fighting similar phenomena. Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, all of these countries fighting their own criminal groups. Colombia has taught them, Colombia has trained many of the officers of these countries, in many cases with support of the United States, financial support of the United States, Canada. I'm not sure the European Union has done it as well, but there is money coming from different countries to support Colombia going to other countries, or the officers of other countries coming to Colombia to be trained in different capacities in fighting, once again, insurgents or organized crime. So that is there. That is one of the key elements. As you mentioned, we're partners. We're strategic partners of NATO. We're not full members of NATO, but we're strategic partners. And in this strategic partnership, we learn from NATO countries, but we teach NATO countries as well how to fight insurgencies, irregular warfare, riverine warfare, which is a capacity that Colombia knows really well, how to fight from rivers, how to deploy from rivers into jungle areas, into this kind of geographical spaces. Colombia do that really well. So if you think about the type of tasks that the army needs to do, that the military forces need to do in the context of human security, we already do that. Like, the military forces already know that. The idea of cooperating for development is not new for the military forces. And that would be kind of a major task in terms of human security. When you think of human security and think all of the dimensions involved with human security, food security, and all of the dimensions that imply the concept itself, like, the military forces have already developed capacities to contribute in those kind of tasks. So if you ask, will Colombia continue to provide their services in line with human security and paz total, I would say the capacity is there. They already know this. They continue to build this. So I would say yes. We have a international diplomatic military strategy to offer these services, to offer this know-how to other countries, and I think that should continue to be exploited. That should continue to be offered. And it should be an integral part of our Colombian foreign policy.
Thank you, Oscar. Juan Pablo, sitting in Santiago with a government of President Gabriel Boric, who was quite keen to have a conversation with Gustavo Petro when the left was winning elections a couple of years ago. Since what's the role here of international actors, both if you think about the level of just bilateral diplomatic relations with Colombia, if you think about the puzzle that's Venezuela at the moment, and how Gustavo Petro has had a conversation with Venezuela trying to appease that front, right? And then something like the Organization of American States, which we haven't basically named in this conversation. So what's your kind of like international perspective on Colombia sitting from outside the country?
Well, actually, Chile was invited to be part of the dialogues with the ELN because we have some experience in the past peace negotiation with the FARC. Chile was invited too. So I think there's a kind of support from Boric government of what Petro is doing or trying to promote as a peace. Also, there's a so-called pink tide across Latin America. So I think most of the government, I'm thinking in Lula's government, Fernandez's government in Argentina, are very favorable with Petro's. approach to total peace. But the main actors here are always Venezuela. As I mentioned, the ELN is binational guerrilla today, with presence in both countries, so it's more difficult to demobilize or negotiate with this guerrilla or attack this guerrilla or whatever you want to do it with the guerrillas. Now Petro is switching the relationship with Venezuela, trying to create some trust using all links with some members of the Venezuela government, and trying to use Venezuela in some way for his objectives in terms of total peace. But for me, in diplomatic terms, it's very interesting how the relationship with the US is evolving. There's a not bad relationship with Biden. He's a Democrat, but there's used to be very close with the US. You mentioned Colombia, $10,000 million of support in the last 2 decades. When you read the last Petro security strategy, they don't even mention the US as a main partner in this security strategy. So for me, there's a change. And I think the relationship with the US was very successful. And I think that Petro is understanding this, and he's trying to play in the leftist card across the Americas and trying to in some way involve the Latin Americans in his ideas. I'm not thinking in the Contadora group in the 80s, but something like that maybe could be possible if Petro try in this new phase, trying to looking for a new approach to this total peace idea, because the ceasefires are failing and I don't see any military movements, and maybe betting in a more diplomatic approach with support of the international community could be an opportunity.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I'm mindful of time. We have 8 minutes, and I think it will be nice if you all have a couple of minutes for your last question. There is one question that I will probably pick from the chat and address to you, Renata, which is by David Rodriguez, in terms of you kind of like mentioned this, and I think it relates back to your concept of Pax Mafiosa. But is it realistic to think that some of the criminal groups will be willing to let go of illegal markets and illegal activities if this happens, if there is a harder push for total peace? And I think we go to a different level, right? We go to the day-to-day neighborhoods of the more vulnerable and deprived parts of the country in which criminal governance has really taken a territory for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the question of the $1 million and the most difficult question. I mean, it seems likely that in big organizations like the Gulf Clan, you have a leadership that is older, that has made a ton of money, and that will be willing to maybe retire, perhaps serve a few years in jail, and then have, as the law proposes, 6% of their income legalized, and then they can just go live with that out of some beach somewhere, and that would be okay. Obviously, these are much more complicated when you're thinking about either middle ranks, younger people who have not yet made that money and that don't see what it would be for them if they withdrew from the illicit economies. And obviously, you have all those people that are living from much sort of lower levels of income through extortion, through other kinds of maybe like just retail selling of drugs. And I think that remains the core of the question, right? The Colombian state and the Colombian economy is not an economy that is conducive for all of these people who have been making a very good living out of illicit economies to transfer into legal economies in a quick and sort of reasonable way. So the answer to that is probably no. That said, I think the question of can we minimize the amount of violence that exists around illicit economies, it's a very valid and pertinent one, because we all know that illicit economies exist everywhere. There's plenty of illicit economies in the US, but we don't see that. Well, we see other kinds of violence, but we don't see the levels of violence that we see in Colombia around drug trafficking, right? We know that in Europe, there is a lot of illicit economies and such. And so I think that one issue that we didn't discuss this today at length, but that is part of the puzzle that Petro is thinking about when he's talking about Paz Total, is obviously talking about a transformation of the drug control regime. And the idea that really we need to start talking about regulation of the markets for at least marijuana and cocaine, if there is ever going to be a solution that is long-term to this problem. I mean, this requires another RUSI event that we can have a very extended conversation about how realistic, how feasible that is. But I think that it's certainly part of the conversation. And I think that's where the US really comes into play. I mean, I've been impressed by the way in which, despite the pretty divergent views that Petro has vis-a-vis the United States, particularly on the question of drug eradication, which has been at the core of the tensions between Washington and Bogota since Petro took power, the US has clearly put out all of its cards on the table to keep this relationship. The US cannot afford to lose Colombia as an ally. I mean, we've seen high levels of visits to Bogota since the moment that Petro arrived. The invitation to talk to Biden, and what happened in Bogota a few weeks ago at the request of the Americans on Venezuela is clearly a sign that the Biden administration is putting a lot of its money keeping Petro close to them, and for very obvious and sort of understandable reasons. But I think Petro's sort of whole wide idea of Paz Total, which would need probably a generation to be able to be implemented properly, relies in a significant way in actually regulating the cocaine markets. That's by no means the only source of illicit economies in Colombia. There's a lot of money that is being made out of mining and other things, but that remains the bulk of it. And so that is a big part of the conversation that he wants to push into the international arena. That's another one of those topics where we're not seeing movement as fast as it probably needs to be, because the country doesn't have a drug strategy at the moment. We know that there is one drafted, but it's still being socialized, and the clock is ticking, and we really need to see what are the proposals that they're going to put on the table.
Thank you very much, Renata, for your insightful comments. I would like to start drawing this to a close, and I think we heard from Renata in advance what her criteria was, if we were in favor or against the success of this 1 hour evaluation of Total Peace. So then I would like to hear from Juan Pablo and probably close with Oscar. Juan Pablo, are we in the presence, is this the momentum for Petro in order to move forward, or is he stuck in the mud in terms of Total Peace? If you can be very brief, please.
Well, I think Petro should prove that he has a plan B. What if the Total Peace fails? He can't achieve the results of the peace dialogues, not peace negotiations. What if Total Peace fails? So I think he needs to prove that he is strong enough to be taken seriously in military terms with these groups, the EMC, the ELN, and the Gulf Clan. But it's a difficult task and challenge. I hope the Colombian militaries are very professional. They are very efficient. But I think this time to prove that the relationship between Petros and the militaries is well suited and could produce results in the field. It's a difficult task, because you know Petro's background changed a lot, and I believe that the military in Colombia are not very happy with this approach with Venezuela, and they don't trust in Venezuela, I know I've been many times. I've been in bases and visiting border areas. There's a lack of trust between them. But I think Petro is facing many flanks, not only in the conflict side, even in the political side. The economic situation in Latin America is not good in every country. So it's a very difficult moment for him, and this is going to be tough.
Thank you for your assessment, Juan Pablo, and thank you for joining us from Santiago. Oscar, please have your final 2 minutes. Do you evaluate this as a positive? Did it pass the mark or not?
Well, pretty much as Renata said before, I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful. I would love this to work. I mean, it's a very ambitious strategy indeed. There's a lot of actors out there, and it's quite ambitious in terms of trying to talk with all of them, and that would be a great step forward. I'm just really hesitant. I have doubts about the possibility to achieve this in 3 years. As Renata said, I really hope that the commissioner has got in his desk something written that is going to give him a guideline of how to proceed on the following years. If that doesn't happen, then we're pretty much screwed. So I am hopeful. I am really hopeful, but I have my big doubts that this is actually going to happen in 3 years coming.
Thank you very much, Oscar. And I also thank everyone who made questions and the over 50 participants that we had online. I think we should all put it down in our calendars that we should meet again in about a year or so and see how Paz Total has moved in the country. I thank you, Juan Pablo, Oscar, and Renata again. And I thank everyone who joined us, and we'll see you again in another